This is RegCast, your edge on RegTech, risk, and regulatory transformation. Hosted by RegTech pioneer PJ DiGiamarino, RegCast delivers regulatory clarity, AI precision, and market trust with expert insights from the front lines. From MiFID III to AI, we connect regulation to execution, charting the path to credible compliance before gaps become capital or reputational risks. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or at regrisklegalsolutions.com and stay ahead of the regulatory curve. PJ DiGiamarino is one of the original architects of RegTech. With a career spanning Barclays, McKinsey, and his pioneering work at JWG Group, PJ has spent the last 20 years helping regulators and financial institutions decode complexity and transform compliance into competitive advantage. Now, as CEO of RegRisk Legal Solutions, he's at the forefront of AI-enabled regulatory intelligence.
Hi, welcome. This is Season 7, Episode 5, and the title says it all. We're in the middle of an AI control plane war, and it's hitting financial services first. So if you're building AI, governing technology, or sitting on the board of a financial services institution, this isn't theoretical anymore. The fines are starting to land, as we covered in the last episode. Sovereignty has really crossed the line in 2026. We've had leaked diplomatic cables, which we discussed in the last episode. Really, the takeaway from that is that the AI infrastructure is being treated as a strategic advantage. And cloud providers are being labeled as potential supply chain risks, even with the AIs themselves being looked at in that way. So governments aren't just shaping regulation, they're shaping access. And this is no longer just a supervisory story. This is a geopolitical story. And so that's why we're here. We want to unpack what the architectural and operational implications are all that. And I'm really pleased to be joined again by Anne Leslie, who you'll remember from Season 5, and Chris Jenkins for the first time, who joins us from Red Hat. Guys, welcome both back for Season 7. Anne, why don't you just kick off and introduce yourself?
Sure. So delighted to be back, PJ. I'm head of cloud risk for EMEA at IBM, and my professional focus is around digital operational resilience and sovereignty. And I spend a lot of time trying to build bridges between people who are looking at those topics from a policy perspective, but more and more trying to make it real in terms of how can we break the inertia, give people more confidence, and actually get the technology operational in a way that serves the business that our clients are looking to drive forward.
Excellent.
Hi there, Chris Jenkins from Red Hat. So I've been in Red Hat 13 years now, so I'm part of the furniture. I work in the EMEA field CTO organization. So my main focus is around cybersecurity and digital sovereignty. The split used to be 20% digital sovereignty, 80% cybersecurity. In the last 6 to 8 months, that's completely flipped around. So I talk with our customers, our partners, internal Red Hat enablement around digital sovereignty and how we can help our customers working with our partners, such as IBM and PJ's team as well. And it's great to be part of this cast.
Well, thank you both for being here. And I think just the way you've positioned that there, Chris and Anna, it leads us to understand where we're coming from. So let me just frame this for people. This is no longer about where the data sits. And historically, that was more the cyber angle on, well, what are we doing? Who has access to what? But this is about customer control. And it's about control over access. It's control over the encryption keys. It's control over the disclosure. It's even about whether the service can be withdrawn and who has the power to get you to be able to move something. And AI has turned cloud infrastructure into this geopolitical infrastructure because sovereignty now lives in the control plane. It's who holds the ability to inspect the replay. If you can't, as we discussed in the last episode, if you can't defend the outcome from a regulatory perspective, that's bad. And it also means someone else might be able to listen in. And that's even a different level of risk, which sovereignty now needs to be thought of in terms of a defense against foreign access. But the upside here is that it's also autonomy, and it's an ability from an economic perspective to be more efficient. So you can choose your workload postures, you can design the portability into the critical AI systems from the start, and you can look at the resilience and the confidentiality rather than collapsing those into one label. And ultimately, we are now a year and a quarter into the DORA regime. We're beginning to understand the nature of critical third parties and how we're supposed to work with them. The UK has a separate regime. Other jurisdictions have done that as well. And now we're really getting our teeth into how are we going to operationalize our understanding of everyone's role in a financial institution. And that's ultimately where we're carrying different types of sovereignty risk. Because when governments diverge in those detailed technical standards, the supervisors are testing the same infrastructure in different ways. Think about it as multiple hands on the AI flight recorder. And ultimately, you need to be able to have the defense in place to be able to say, what is sovereignty in my operating model? How do we defend it? And how do we control it? So let's start talking about the first problem, about the definition from an operational perspective. And I'd like to kick off with you, please.
Sure.
There's no one single definition of sovereignty. Every podcast I've ever heard on it starts off that way. Let's move beyond that. Say which elements are really non-negotiable from your point of view, and how do you factor in the access control, encryption, services, portability, all this good stuff when you're dealing with clients?
So I'll start by saying definitions are important in a certain context. I'm all for definitions in terms of the clarity they bring. But what I was noticing on this topic is that they were causing inertia because people were arguing about, well, my definition is better than yours, and my definition says this, and yours says that, etc. And it doesn't actually advance what we're trying to do. So I don't argue about the definitions anymore. If there are people who want to get involved in those debates, I let them. And like I say, it's important in a certain context. I'm much more interested in what are we trying to do? It's a real business focus. So these conversations require face time, right? They're not something you can do in a PPT deck. You can't do it with a brochure. You actually have to have conversations with people. And I try to workshop this. So when people say to me, what's IBM's POV on sovereignty? I'll start by giving them part of an answer just to open up the conversation, and then try and get them to talk about when they're asking that question, what's on their mind? What are they worried about? And getting them to articulate fears that are often very vague. But once you build up a relationship of trust, people start to say, well, I'm worried about my data. I'm worried about a GDPR fine. I'm worried about my supervisor coming down on me like a ton of bricks because of a decision we've made using AI that we can't defend. All of those things need to be articulated, right? And to get quite specific. So we can start saying, if you're sovereign, you're more of what and less of what else, right? And that's essentially how I think about it. It's quite simplistic. So some organizations will be very worried about access to their data, right? And that we'll turn that into a requirement. Others will be more concerned about survivability. What if suddenly there are sanctions, for example, or a geopolitical shift, and I'm not able to access the technology stack that I rely on? There are so many dimensions that this could be placed on, and everybody has a different position on the spectrum. And that's where it has to be business focused and getting very specific about more control over what, at what level of the stack, and to what degree. And that's where the definitional approach falls short, because it gets stuck on the concept without actually moving towards outcomes. And I try to shift the conversation to outcomes.
When I was a COO at a bank for technology, my boss used to ask me, there's two drivers here at this bank. It's make money, stay out of jail. Which one is this?
Yeah. It will depend on the organization. Some organizations have a high risk appetite. They just want to be sure that they're able to have clarity about what risks they're taking. And I think that's one of the things where there's been pressure put on technology providers, including cloud providers, is give us more transparency. We're not asking you to solve unsolvable problems, but give us transparency about your operations so that we can make risk-informed decisions and we know what we're up against. That way, as a financial institution, we can determine whether that approach suits us, and if it does, we'll continue. But in the absence of that transparency, we can't make a risk-informed decision.
Which means they don't have the information today about what they're currently doing and where those risks are.
Sometimes they don't have it simply because they haven't thought about it. Sometimes they haven't got it because technology providers haven't needed up until now to share that. Not necessarily because there's a desire to obfuscate, but we've seen it with DORA, we're seeing it in the UK as well. The responsibilities between consumers of technology, the financial institutions, and technology providers themselves, there is more of a need now for technology providers to proactively share information about how they're operating, where their operations are, etc. That hadn't been the case before. So that's a work in progress, and I think we're seeing more and more information sharing happening proactively.
Chris, would you concur? Is that this part of the driver for you?
Yeah, I completely agree. From the definition side of things in digital sovereignty, it is, all the customers I've spoken with, it's a very nebulous concept. And again, if you have a nebulous concept, it's hard to try and define a solution because you don't know what you're trying to get to. So having this idea of minimal viable sovereignty, it depends on the organization you work in, the vertical you work in. So digital sovereignty for healthcare could be different to defense, could be different to FSI. There's no one size fit all from a digital sovereignty point of view. And it reminds me back in the days when people were saying, move everything to the cloud, without understanding what it actually meant, moving to the cloud. It gave you agility, it was great. But by doing that, you start to give up some of your autonomy. You start to give up some of your control. And the same kind of thing, I think, with digital sovereignty. People aren't completely sure of what it means. So therefore, it's hard to define any strategic initiatives to actually get there. And one point that you mentioned earlier on, PG, as well, which is really, really true. Digital sovereignty is not just regulatory compliance checkboxes. So it's not like some of the old regulatory compliance. You can check a box and you are compliant to it. It's a strategic initiative, strategic lever for customers to protect their assets, ensure continuity of core operations, as mentioned earlier on. It's a long-term project. It's not something that sysadmins can do. It should be a C-level initiative to try and drive the organization forward so they can become independent with their digital platforms and their digital environments.
Is it also, Chris, about rationalizing the efficiency or the way they've got things operating? Because one of the challenges is when everybody went to cloud, they didn't think through the economics very well. And the same thing's happening with the AI. We're looking at the prices and how they're being charged for those API access and calls and models and all that. And so is this a chance to look at the efficiency and the cost management as well?
Yeah, it is very much so. So there are quite a few of the Neo clouds, the sovereign clouds coming out nowadays. And if you compare them to the major hyperscalers, they are a lot more expensive. So the cost factor kicks in there. But also from a data point of view, going back to the data sovereignty side of things, you don't need to have all of your data in a sovereign environment. You can have some of your data, your processing, your workloads in a public hyperscaler. You don't have to move everything from a hyperscaler to a private cloud or to on-prem. So it's having that risk and cost benefit within the organization to say, okay, we've got our sensitive regulated data that must remain on-prem in our data center. Business critical stuff, okay, we may be able to have that in a public private cloud. And then the public general workloads data, you could put in a hyperscaler without any issues on there. So again, it's that risk management, having the zero trust architectures in place as well, from a technical point of view. So you know where your data is, who can access it, and from a legal point of view as well, who from outside of your organization can access it, if we put it that way.
There's one actually interesting point on this, which is what I've noticed across verticals is that very few organizations can confidently articulate what their critical business functions are.
Mm-hmm.
And it blows my mind because I know large organizations can by their very nature be dysfunctional, but given the task of saying, these are the core services that drive our economic engine. I mean, you said it, PJ, right? Does this keep us out of jail or does it make us money? That's honestly the missing piece for a lot of these conversations, because we've always sort of said in cybersecurity, it's difficult to articulate the value because security is not aligned with the business. It's an easy trope and there's an element of truth in it, but in some ways the business isn't helping itself because the business isn't articulating super well what is driving the economic engine. And without that clarity and that consensus, you can't start really making risk-informed decisions. You can't start saying, we're okay putting this over here because the risk of it being accessed, it's not great, but we can live with it. But if we had a problem of accessibility on this workload over here, that would kill us. And the absence of that clarity around critical business functions, critical functions and important business services, it's mandatory in financial services, but it's relevant across the board.
Yeah.
But
for financial services, let's drill into that, because I think you raise a very interesting point, because that's not the way the markets work.
Yeah.
Right. The markets work. I have a great new economic idea. I fund that team. I give that MD the responsibility. They make the investment decisions. They get they take the risk. They get the reward.
Yeah.
Now, in a lot of that now, they've been making their own infrastructure calls. You know, we're going to put this load here. We're going to use the cloud for that. We're going to lock this stuff up. And there isn't a lot of transparency for obvious reasons across the many different business silos. Right. Now, DORA asks you to open all that up and have that conversation at a higher level. But there is this whole voyage of discovery into, OK, well, how does it all actually fit together? And of course, the guys in the back office know because they've got all the plumbing, but they don't actually know how the business works. So you're really forcing the whole organization in a much different space. So when a regulator comes in and he says, well, show us how you prevented unauthorized access, or how your inference happened, or what was this exit condition, and could you test that like Dora said you had to do? You know, how do you handle that? I guess, Chris, what are some of the points to address that you work with any type of firm, especially banks, on in that kind of space?
I think that's a really interesting point from that kind of side of things, going back to the data. So we work in a more modular environment nowadays. Back in the days, we used to have monolithic workloads with monolithic data lakes and that kind of thing. Things got a lot more modular now. So like I say, different MDs within a bank may have different priorities, and therefore having this data taxonomy for them to say, okay, this data can reside here, this data can reside there, that's a great start. But because we have all of these modular independencies now, so all the kind of API calls, like you were saying as well, okay, you've got data over here, which is more secure. You have data over here, which is a more of an open workload. But do you know the connections between the two? So if someone were to access something in your public domain, you have an API call from that back through your demilitarized zone, back into your Chrome jewels, so to speak. So having data segregation, yes, it's great, but also understanding the interoperability between all of those systems. So the MD may have his one application running here, which has got a link back to the internal bank's identity and access management system, for an example. You need to secure that layer going back into your internal systems as well. So again, data taxonomy, data classification, and it is surprising, as mentioned earlier on, that some people are just starting down this line of working out what can go where and what can access what within the organization.
It kind of feels like we have, did you ever take apart a Rubik's Cube when you were younger? It kind of feels like we've kind of done that, which is we've got loads of cubes. We haven't got that hard plastic thing in the middle that holds it all together. And that's where the secret sauce is here, right? Which is having the ability to pivot and shift. But there's something very, very adaptable but still solid in the middle that keeps it all hanging together. And I think that's what we're beginning to see emerge. And I'm convinced it's going to be a massive differentiator going forward. because while the regulations and the regulations around op-res and the concerns around sovereignty, they're feeling very burdensome right now. Mm-hmm. Being able to make those risk-informed decisions that are aligned to the business, where we're not stopping agility, technology is still being consumed, that's the magic spot to be in. And it's trying to figure out what that connective tissue in the middle is.
So
I think also,
let me ask you both this question. You can figure how you want to answer it. But if the Rubik's Cube is different hyperscalers, and let's just imagine there's an EU one and we had a couple of the US ones, what is it that we're missing to plug them together with the internal infrastructure?
I think I love the analogy of a Rubik's Cube as well. So just to demonstrate how my brain works, I never used to take a Rubik's Cube apart. I would just take off the colored labels and then put the labels back in the right place. So in a way, I'm doing sovereignty theater, the same kind of thing. It's the same Rubik's Cube with the same issues and the same physical movements. I'm just changing the pretty bits on the front. So it's almost like if we compare that back to the sovereignty side of things, it's sovereign washing. It's to say, we've done our sovereign theatre, but the underlying infrastructure is all exactly the same. So again, it's that sovereign washing concept that people say, yes, we're now digitally sovereign because we have these specific colours on the Rubik Cube, but the underlying infrastructure is still broken. Strange analogy. Apologies for that's how my brain works.
But how do you fix that? To Anne's point, if you did pull it apart, what's the thing you got to put in the middle to get it right?
Yeah, it's having the architecture. So if you were to go to IKEA, for an example, and buy a bookshelf, it would come with instructions. So you would know that if you were to take your bookshelf apart, you would know how to put it back together in. So it's a complicated problem. If you were to have your IKEA bookshop without the instructions, it becomes a complex problem. So a complicated problem, you've got the instructions. Complex problem, you don't have the instructions, and there are a lot of moving parts that you don't understand. So having that initial architecture, I mentioned earlier on zero trust architectures, having that in place, you will have the building blocks then to rebuild your Rubik's Cube or your infrastructure. Yeah. And then also having the portability to say, okay, we've built our secure infrastructure here. Now we've got the portability to lift, shift, move it to a different provider, move it on-prem, move it to a sovereign cloud, move it wherever we want. We've got the underlying blueprints of our Rubik's Cube, and we can rebuild that wherever we like.
Just to maybe double click on that point about this being a complex problem space is not just conceptual, whatever. It's actually really important, because in a complex problem space, the best way forward is sort of probe, sense, and respond, right? You don't go in with a massive program. What you're looking for is being really, really honest about the reality and the constraints, and then designing around them and looking at things like interoperability, open standards, anything that will give you maximum optionality, right? You're looking to maximize options and then trying to find a way forward. So starting with an architecture that's not going to lock you in, that allows you to operate now and will give you options of moving forward when things might shift. For example, things that could shift might be availability of more options in Europe, right? Suddenly there are more technological providers available offering the scale and breadth and depth services that aren't available right now. Something more adverse that could happen is a big geopolitical incident. But it's just about accepting the discomfort of not having a 5-year plan ahead that's all nicely laid out and budget approved. Our organizations love that, and there's a very human reason why. But in a complex space, things shift too much. And while it's very reassuring to plan in a linear way that far ahead, it's one of the explanations why programs like that fail so often. So I think that missing bit, part of that missing bit that we were talking about, beyond the architecture, there's a cultural aspect of human behavior, which is, are we willing to lean into the discomfort of not knowing and having shorter planning cycles, a willingness to possibly getting it wrong, but we'll be okay. We haven't put all of our eggs in one basket. We'll be able to pivot and recover. And it's just a shift in behavioral thinking that shows up in architectures and contracts and procurement. But the starting point is, I think, a shift in how we're thinking, and the planning and execution horizons are different to what they were in the past.
I think that's a really interesting point there as well. Again, from an analogy point of view, going from waterfall to agile development, same kind of thing from a digital sovereignty planning. You must be able to be malleable. You must be able to pivot as well, because we have the Cyber Resiliency Act coming in. We've got the new security bill in the UK coming in. So if you have your five-year plan, you may deliver it in 5 years, but it could be completely out of touch with the regulations that have come in since the start of that plan. So malleability, agility, and the ability to pivot, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and regulators are themselves pivoting and are a big known unknown variable in all this, right? Yeah. So like ESMA, for example, just came out this month with updated guidance on what is algo trading. That affects the thinking about how you need to control the deployment of AI and pre-trade controls. That will then mean you need to think about this Rubik's Cube, or whatever this analogy is, in a different way. But you have to have those pieces on the table so you can understand what they mean. So let's get to the supervisory test then, because I think this is the key bit, which is when they're looking for enforceable controls, i.e., I want you to replay how you made that decision and show me that the outcome in the market is appropriate. Oh, by the way, the market crashed yesterday. You've got to be able to get that near real time, and you need to think about it in a continuous compliance optic. So, Chris, how do you think about what's required there?
I always go for the idea of repeatability. So again, moving the conversation from the architectural side of things to more of a regulatory governance is having compliance as code. So the supervisors themselves, they don't want to see a dusty PDF policy document that you created 3 years ago. They want to see the live telemetry that actually proves that the policy is actually being enforced right now. So you have compliance as code, and then policy as code as well. So translating the natural language regulations into machine readable code. So something like the Open Policy Agent, or the wonderful tools that PG team are doing at the moment, but having an audit trail as well. So you can say, we have this enforcement, what does it link back to? So if a supervisor were to ask, why is this data being anonymized? Or why is person or agent X allowed to access this data? You can immediately point back to that specific sovereignty or governance requirement or regulation that satisfies that specific action that's on there. So it's having attestation and kind of backwards compliance in a way. So you can say, we have to do this. It's enforced using this mechanism, and this is the outcome. And then you can reverse it to say, this outcome became because of this enforcement, which became outcome of this regulation. So it's having the full transparent flow from the actual regulation to the outcome of actions of what people or AI agents are doing on the system. That was a bit of a long-winded answer there, I'm afraid.
I'm loving it. I want to jump in, but Anne, I want to hear from you first.
The repeatability aspect is, one of the things that we've heard from supervisors is they're expecting that there be somebody who has such mastery of the operations that they can almost take on the role of chief storyteller. Right? And it sounds a little bit facetious, but the storyteller is the person who's able to double click on the most important elements of what's going on and explain how it all fits together. And it seems to be a missing role or missing capability in a lot of organizations, which is causing supervisory exams and inspections to be arguably a bit more painful than they might need to be. That's where I think some of the supervisory expectations are going, is that there be an expectation that firms, nobody's looking for perfection. And I know we like to, sort of badmouth regulation a lot and say that, the regulators are a difficult bunch. Honestly, I've seen a massive shift in the skill sets that they're showing up with, and their technical ability is very, very high. And What I'm seeing is that they're looking for confidence that firms are staying in control of their technology use. Are you in the driver's seat? Do you know what you're doing? Have you identified the risks? Are you mitigating them? And can you give us confidence with evidence that you are actually in control? We're not going to just take you at your word. Show us. Yeah. So that requires upfront thinking. Again, the architecture, designing controls, engineering platforms so that it's not just compliant, it's secure, it's delivering outcomes. And the firms that are in the position to arm whoever it is going into those conversations, again, you're golden if you have that evidence, if you're able to articulate, this is what we're choosing to do. You might be taking on a high degree of risk, but if it's managed, and you're able to demonstrate that it's managed and you're driving your business forward because that's who you are as an organization, that's a defensible position.
Yeah, and I think it's a really exciting time for RegTech as well, because for the last decade, RegTech's about, let me add something on, or let me dump some data into your organization. It doesn't work anymore. We're in a new era of RegTech where we actually need to solve for the problem of how do you evidence what's happening on the ground, in the stack, back to the actual compliance obligations, which means you need to take that text all the way through to the evidence chain. And ultimately, I think that's the exciting thing about having this notion of a regulatory control fabric that can account for sovereignty, because these rules change far too fast for people with day jobs to keep up with them. Everyone's very busy running the bank. You don't have time for lots of change analysis. You really need to react now. And ultimately, that's the new standard of proof. So we're getting ready for this conference on the 26th of March, and there's just so much going on, and it's really great to have this time to clear it with the market. What are the key messages you would land for the industry, and in terms of what are the things we ought to be focused on there?
So mutualizing learning, talking to your peers, talking to technology providers, extending your circle, maybe, just to find out what's going on. One of the things that we run in IBM is the Financial Services Cloud Council. And I'm just always really encouraged to see, sometimes we bring in regulators, we bring in different stakeholders from across the ecosystem. People share, and people want to hear about what's working, what's not working. There's a massive space for collaboration. There's a massive space for knowledge sharing. On top of that, people are going to compete. That's fair game. But there are things where it makes no sense to compete. And I know, for example, PJ, you and I have been involved in standards. There's no point competing on standards, but they're massively important. So, the conference that is coming up, great forum for in-person conversations. I always come back to there's nothing that beats relationships. So building more and more relationships around these topics, I think, is never going to go to waste.
Chris?
100%. I think from a Red Hat point of view, we tend to focus on tech a little bit too much. We are tech experts, so we can talk about confidential computing, open source, multi-cloud portability, automation, CI/CD pipelines for governance. They're great. But I would say at the conference coming up, I would recommend to people to do an impersonation of a meerkat. Just look above a little bit to say, what's everyone else talking about? Because there's a lot of experts across the ecosystem at this event. So talk to your they may be your competitors, but there may be some areas where synergy could really benefit both of you. So it's the collaboration. Have the technical talk, yes, that's great, but also understand pain points, challenges, how other people have done things in a different way. So being open to change. I wouldn't say dress up as a meerkat, but you know what I mean? The concept of put your head above the technical parapet a little bit and listen to what's going on. Because, as we said at the top of the call, these things are changing very, very quickly. There may be a new regulation come out that you're not aware of. So talk to people about it. Get some advice on how they're handling it within the organization as well.
Amen to all that, guys. Thank you for those perspectives. And I'll only just add that, there are across the day so many different perspectives that are now changing in their own little domains. So now you need that holistic view. And I think that's where sovereignty, really forces this AI conversation to a control plane. And trying to understand what exactly that means from an architectural perspective, while I've got agents that I'm using to, make a lot more decisions and take control away from what traditionally have been these wonderful, tools that we did on a per seat basis, those are really fundamental architectural disruptors. And the winners will be the ones that can work out how do they leverage these tools with a better footprint to, replay the regulation to enforcement discussion that comes with defending those outcomes. So thanks very much, guys. I really, really look forward to the debate, and we'll feed back afterwards on this podcast. Please join us. It's regtechconference.co.uk. Still space to register now. Hope to see you on 26th of March. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Regcast, delivering regulatory clarity, AI precision, and market trust. Please subscribe and share. It helps more people join this vital conversation. Find all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or at regrissolutions.com.